Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. Today I'm sitting down with Professor Faten Ghosn from the University of Essex for a special episode on the current events in the Middle East, particularly the US-Israel war with Iran. Faten Ghosn is Professor and Head of the Department of Government at the University of Essex and non-residential fellow at the Centre for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Arizona. Her work in this area focuses on enemy images as obstacles to cooperation, militarised interstate disputes, and transnational justice. So thank you so much, Faten, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
One of the biggest questions here then will be, at the time of us speaking at least, the US and Israel are continuing to carry out strikes on Iran. So why are these strikes happening?
Right. So, yeah, they've continued and now are expanding, right, to other nations in the region. Now, what is interesting is the public messaging from Washington and Tel Aviv have shifted even with the span of the first week of the conflict. So when it started on February 28, President Trump presented the strikes as an act of liberation, explicitly telling the Iranian people that this was their unique chance, using his own words, to take over the government. He framed the military action as a catalyst for change, urging Iranians to take back their country. But within a couple of hours, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, described Operation Roaring Lion as a mission to remove the existential threat posed by the Iranian regime. 2 days later, on March 2nd, Secretary of State Marco Rubio framed the timing as a defensive necessity, in reality explaining that this was a preemptive strike, arguing that the US really had to strike first in order to neutralize an inevitable Iranian retaliation against the American forces, because that would have followed a planned attack by Israel. Then 2 days after that, on March 4th, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, defined this mission as a final resolution, and he said that this is moving beyond containment to finish the conflict by systematically dismantling Iranian Navy and ballistic missile industry. So what it looks like is for these two countries carrying out the attacks, they might not only have different goals and motivations, none of the reasons that they have given align with the legal definition of the use of force against another sovereign country.
Amazing, thank you. I think that's a really nice kind of overview of what's been happening, because I know that it's been quite a complicated area at the moment. So one thing you mentioned there was that President Trump has repeatedly spoken about regime change, and even encouraged, I think, even in January of this year, Iranians to protest against their leaders. So if we take this at face value, do you think this is a likely outcome, that there will be regime change in Iran?
In the short term, consensus among experts is that no regime change will not be the likely outcome. And in fact, it's interesting, if you read some of the reporting coming out, including in Reuters, they've indicated that many US officials themselves are skeptical that targeted strikes or leadership decapitation will reliably trigger a collapse of the system. And there's significant risk that such aggression could actually instead harden the system and triggering what we call in political science rallying around the flag effect, or even empowering the most radical elements of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, also known as the IRGC, to seize control. So regime change is very difficult to deliver, especially in a country in Iran, where power is actually deeply entrenched across institutions and vast patronage networks. And even beyond just the Iranian context, right? If we look at the broader political science literature, it suggests that foreign imposed regime change are rarely successful in establishing a democratic outcome. And let's take a couple of recent examples, right? Think back to January 2026, the abduction of President Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela underscores this reality. Despite the removal of the head of the state, the underlying system has remained exactly the same. And also this latest failure confirms that decapitation strikes as well as interventions, like thinking about in Iraq and Afghanistan, they typically result in institutional resilience or chaotic vacuum, but they have not resulted in a democratic liberation, which has been promised by the US administration.
Thanks. And if we stay in American politics then for a second, I know that some of your work is focused on the ways that dehumanizing images for a country's adversaries can alter citizen preferences for cooperation in that country. So could you tell us a little bit more about this work and perhaps how the images of Iran and its supreme leader have been portrayed to the US public and how this might have influenced their public opinion in the States at least?
Yeah, I mean, the core finding of my research with Dr. Burju Bayram, which was published actually last year in Cooperation and Conflict, is that when an adversary is portrayed as less than human, and this could be casting them as barbaric or evil, or even likening them to cancer or pest, what this does is it creates a psychological barrier to strategic thinking. So this process of dehumanization strips the outgroup of any basic human traits and rights, which then makes citizens significantly less supportive of negotiation and more accepting of coercion and punishment. So in the United States, Iran has often been, including now, described using language that portrays it as irrational or dangerous. And the leaders have gone even, and going back, right, not just today, going back, describing it as the embodiment of evil. And any agreement with them is akin to an agreement with the devil. That was the previous Speaker of the House, Boehner, saying that a while back, when US was negotiating with Iran for the nuclear deal. So when conflicts are framed this way, this diplomacy can start to look like weakness or appeasement, while military action begins to look like as that is the obvious solution. And this psychological framing was reinforced during this latest conflict, whether it was by Prime Minister Netanyahu when he invoked the biblical holiday of Purim to equate the modern Iranian leadership with the ancient villain Haman, declaring, and I quote in his words, the end of the evil regime will also come. I also heard an interview with President Trump where he described the Iranian regime as cancerous. And so this is a textbook examples of using dehumanizing imagery to cast targets' motive as evil and unlimited. And so my co-author and I argue this effectively ties the hands of a policymaker, and so making future trust inconceivable by certain elements of the public.
And even with these kind of dehumanizing images, it seems that most Americans don't actually approve of the US bombing Iran. So what do you think that says about the state of US democracy and that a president can make such a consequential decision to go to war without either the support of his citizens or even congressional approval? And are there things that can be done about that?
Yeah. I mean, what it definitely tells us is that American democracy is under strain. And this is not just this issue, like there's been a series of issues in the US. So constitutionally, the power to declare war sits with Congress. Yet presidents have, and not just President Trump, have increasingly been able to initiate military action first and then force the political system to react afterwards. So several scholars have shown that the US war-making authority has gradually shifted toward the executive branch, and some have even labeled this and describing it as an imperial presidency. And so when the public opposes a war, Congress hesitates, but the president still goes forward. Well, this creates issues with democratic accountability, right? Now, to go back to this case recently, several members of Congress are trying to push back in several ways. First, in both the House and the Senate, members of Congress introduced war power resolutions requiring congressional authorization for military action against Iran. It fell short by just a couple of votes. It was in the Senate 53 versus 47, and in the House it was 219 versus 12. Now, some despite this failure, some now are trying to propose restrictions on funding because it needs to come back for funding, right? And they want to try to put restrictions on that. So these are the main constitutional tools Congress has. However, at the same time, we may begin seeing political corrections. And what do I mean by that? In recent special elections, Democrats have been winning in districts that Trump carried in 2024. And some analysis now suggests that not only the House, but maybe even the Senate could come back into play in November, given how unpopular this war is, alongside issues with job performance on the economy and the handling of immigration.
Thank you. I think that's a really good overview of the US political landscape. So if we move back more towards the conflicts, then do you think that there can be scope for negotiations? And if there can, how might these be managed?
I mean, there's always scope for negotiations, but in this case, it will only occur if the objective shifts from maximalist victory to control de-escalation, right? Just before the war, I mean, I recall, I think it was the day before, if I'm not mistaken, you had an Omani official on CNN discussing the mediation that was going on and how positive that was. And he reported some progress which suggests that diplomacy is not structurally impossible. Now, the problem is that active bombardment will radically shrink the political space for compromise. And the language coming out from the White House, especially when President Trump talks about unconditional surrender, he's engaging in what we negotiation scholars call hard bargaining, right? And this sets an extremely rigid, publicly made demand. And so this can backfire strategically, right? Because by publicly stating your maximalist position, you're tying your own hand and you're making it politically harder to accept compromising without appearing weak or that you're retreating. And so research in international bargaining shows that such inflexible demands often prolong conflict because the opposing side now also cannot just concede without suffering some domestic humiliation. And so especially in this case, if you're thinking about Iran with the assassination and killing of their spiritual and head of state, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and so and the deaths and destruction, so that they with such public demands, they need something in return for both sides to claim that they received. So a renewed diplomatic process has to be through indirect channels, probably, maybe Oman again, third party. And initially, the agenda needs to be narrow, right? Maybe a ceasefire, shipping lanes, something in which, and you also have to be careful about the sequencing of those negotiations, because if you try to put too much all at the same time, it will fail. And so you need each side to be able to walk away at minimum to their own domestic audience to say, I got something. And also with Iran, there's something now that they have to be careful about. This is the second time they're getting strikes, right? Like last June, that happened again. And so they need a deterrent effect. And I think this is why you saw them expanding into the region, saying, no, 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 if we're going to get affected, you all are going to get affected as well.
How significant was the killing of Ali Khamenei then for the political system, I guess, in Iran, that would obviously also be part of this negotiation?
Right. I mean, look, it is highly significant symbolically and psychologically, but this does not automatically mean the collapse of the system. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei sat at the center of the Islamic Republic's ideological legitimacy and elite balancing. And so his death will more than likely open the door for even a hardline successor, especially given the news that we have of his son, Ayatollah or Mujtaba Khamenei, right? He has been selected. We don't know much about him. We do know he's a little bit more conservative than his father, but we also have to recognize that he lost not only his father in this attack, his mother, his wife, and it's being claimed a son, I think, maybe, and he's injured, right? So it even makes it more likely that he's going to be even more hardliner than maybe before this attack he would have been. Um, it's also worth noting, though, and I don't think we're talking about this enough, that directly assassinating the head of another state is historically unprecedented and extremely risky because it can trigger major escalation and undermine core international norms. We have been used to over the years of the decapitation, assassination of heads of non-state actors, right? But this is different. And what worries me is that this is exactly what we saw with the war in Iraq in 2003. It violated certain norms about the usage of force, and opened the door for Russia's war in Georgia in 2008 and then in Ukraine in 2022.
Do you think meaningful change can come from within Iran then, given the appointment of a new Ayatollah? Essentially, I think there the question is reform possible within their current political system, and how that's set up?
I mean, limited reform is possible, but transformative reform, especially after what is happening, is going to be much harder, right? So we've seen in the past with election of relatively more moderate figures that the president's room to maneuver is heavily constrained by the supreme leader, by the Guardian Council, security establishment. So the system can absorb some of these demands while blocking structural democratization. But meaningful long-term change is far more likely to emerge from internal social and political pressure than from any foreign bombardment. Whether the pressure produces reform, rupture, or repression ultimately depends on a variety of factors, including elite cohesion and the state's capacity and willingness to use coercive power. And so, external military intervention that's killing a lot of innocent civilian will actually make those reformers much more difficult for those reformers to actually make the changes that they want. Because again, like I said, it's going to harden individuals and people, and it's going to create a much more rally around the flag effect at this moment in time.
What does democracy mean and kind of look like then in the current Iranian context? And how does that differ from um, our ideals of democracy, for example, in the UK, where I know lots of our listeners are based, in the US, Israel as well?
Um, I know we often speak about Western ideas of democracy, but I think most recent events, including in the UK, show us that they're not even stable and universally agreed upon, right? Whether it was the UK or the US. And right now, we're witnessing significant democratic backsliding across the global north. So that even means within Western society today, there's less consensus than there was once about what democratic practice should look like in reality. And so in the Iranian context, democracy is also deeply contested, just like here, just like in the US, because Iran does have election and Republican institutions, but they operate within a theocratic framework where unelected bodies, most notably the Guardian Council, can vet candidates, narrow the field of political competition, and override elected institution. However, when many Iranians do call for democracy, they're often demanding more than just elections, right? They're calling for genuine political contestation, no vetting by some Guardian Council, civil liberties, and accountable government free from any clerical guardianship.
Thanks. I think that's a really important point, that the whole reason we do this podcast, right, is that there is democratic backsliding everywhere, and we maybe need to rethink how we think about democracy. And I think that might be particularly important when some commentators have been talking about exporting democracy by force. I know we've touched a little bit on that throughout this discussion, but are there any lessons that we can learn from attempts that we've had to do this before. I guess particularly in the Middle Eastern context.
Yeah. Well, the central lesson that we can 100% state confidently is that external military force can topple regimes, but it is much worse about when it comes to building legitimate political orders afterwards. Think Iraq, but also think Libya, right? Both of these cases are should make us cautionary when we think about intervention, because intervention can destroy, in both cases it did so, an existing center of power, whether it was President Saddam Hussein, or whether it was President Muammar Gaddafi. But then in the end, you produced institutions that had little trust. There was no real rule of law or inclusive state capacity. So the real lesson is that democracy cannot be meaningfully delivered through bombs. At best, outsider can create space, but domestic legitimacy, institutions, and bargaining have to do the rest.
I think that's a great point. And are there any kind of comparisons that we can make, perhaps, between different socio-political changes that have happened in the Middle East? It's not, if democracy isn't going to be delivered through bombs, like you've so eloquently just put, can we kind of look towards different changes, for example, the Arab Spring revolutions, and also the events that led up to this war in the first place within Iran?
I mean, we need to be careful, because the Arab Spring did show us that protests can bring dramatic political change, but it also showed us how difficult it is to sustain that change. Let's think about, when we think about the Arab Spring, we think about really only one case, which was seen as a success story, and that is Tunisia, right? It held free elections, adopted a democratic constitution after the fall of President Ben Ali. But even there, the democratic transition has largely collapsed after President Kais Saied suspended parliament and concentrated power in his own hands. So one of the key lessons from Tunisia and other Arab Spring cases is that political change alone is not enough. People did gain more political rights, but then many saw little improvement in their economic lives, which was the reason and the frustration, right, of that revolution in Tunisia, right? When we think about the young vendor who lit himself on fire, right, because of the economic condition. And so they gained some political freedoms, but no change in their economic lives. And that frustration then fueled populism and eventually weaken the democratic institutions. Now, we are definitely seeing some of the underlying reasons in Iran: economic hardship, corruption, frustration with political exclusion, quite similar to what we saw during the Arab Spring. But there's also an important difference. Iran's leadership has been watching this since 2011. And they spent more than a decade studying those uprisings and building a very strong security and surveillance system. So that means that the path from protest to political change in Iran is likely much harder and potentially more violent than happened in many of the Arab Spring cases.
So we have seen some protests, like you say, within Iran itself. What have been some of the main factors there that have caused this, the most recent wave?
Similar to across the Arab Spring, right? The immediate trigger was economic crisis, soaring inflation, the currency collapsing, inability to access medicine, rising living cost shortages, and broader exhaustion with the economic mismanagement. But those material grievances quickly fused with long-standing political anger over repression, corruption, and censorship. So you had these two big things colliding together. And so the authorities' response, which was heavy-handed, including blackout, lethal repression, killing many individuals, and information control, only reinforced the sense that this was a systemic crisis and not just a single issue protest.
I guess the final question have to ask something around how you think the war might reshape alliances within the Middle East, and perhaps beyond, and how might that shape outcomes for Iranian citizens themselves?
I mean, regionally, the war is already testing alliances, right? Gulf states are trying to avoid being dragged in. Iraqi militias appear more hesitant than in the past, and outside powers are recalculating around energy, shipping, and escalation risk. I read in piece recently in the Access, and I think they were saying that over 20 nations now can be seen as involved in different levels, right? Whether moving a ship to protect something is also indirectly being involved, maybe not in the fighting, but at least in the protection. And we've also been hearing how Russia has been helping behind the scenes for Iran, and now China may be stepping up. So I think in the last, I don't know, since World War II, I would say we are much closer now to a World War III scenario than I think we were with Russia and Ukraine. And it depends, right? It depends, because I think we're underestimating that Iran right now is trying to prolong the conflict and to fight what we call traditional military warfare. But we quite know that the Iranians and their allies are capable of fighting an insurgency conflict as well. So what we might see is then an expansion from a traditional interstate conflict to then insurgency style, which can prolong and drag region and much more. Now, for Iranian citizens, the likely short-term effects are grim, regardless what political preference. Fear, displacement, shortages, blackout conditions, and a tighter security environment. We've also heard of attacks on water desalination, right, which is a war crime. It's against the Geneva Convention. So we're seeing that there are no rules. The rules of engagement are not being followed, whether by Israel or the U.S., and especially when you have the Secretary of War saying that these rules of engagement actually constrain the United States. Well, they're there for a reason. They emerged after World War II for a reason. And so while he and others may point to some of the weakening of the regime as a potential opening for change, it is the civilians, the innocent civilian, who are bearing the immediate cost of the war. So far, official reports suggest that more than 1,300 Iranians have already been killed, including at least 165 children at an all-girls school in Minab region. So it looks really, unfortunately, bad for the Iranian citizens right now.
Great, thank you. And I know that's not a very hopeful note for us to finish on, but I would like to say thank you so much for joining us today and for really explaining what's going on in the Iran conflict at the moment.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.